All right. We've got enough people here. I'm going to dive in and just start talking. More people will probably trickle in, but we have a lot to talk about today, so I don't want to waste too much time. So yeah, so to start, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam. I've been working at Bubble about 3 years now. I started on our success team back in 2022 as a customer support representative. So back then, if you were reaching out with a bug report or some, just reaching out to support at bubble.io, I was one of the people that was responding to your emails and helping you fix bugs in the product. About a year later, in January 2023, I joined our product team as an internal Bubble developer, working with Maria, John, and Andrew, who are in the chat today and also joining the session. So our team was responsible for most of bubble.io, or everything on bubble.io except for the editor, basically. So all marketing pages, user onboarding flows, and we build that with Bubble, with the Bubble app. And then this week, actually, I'm transferring over to the AI team as a software engineer. So excited to start working on conversational editing and all that good stuff in the editor. So, my background is largely non-technical. I came in, like, Bubble introduced me to being a technical person, honestly. I've taught myself as much as I can about code over the past couple of years, but I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert. I'm a fairly junior engineer who knows a little bit about code, but is still learning every day. And so I want to be clear, this is not a learn to code session. We're going to be talking about how to leverage all these great new AI tools to expand your Bubble app and basically to make complex functionality much easier on Bubble. So I'm going to dive right in. What we're going to cover today is the OpenAI assistance flow. So just in the chat, has anyone used the OpenAI assistance API before, or is anyone actively using it in their app? It'd be cool for me to get a good idea of if you've used it, or also just comment if you haven't used it before, you've never heard of it. That would be helpful. We're going to talk about what are tools. I think this is one of the most powerful things about assistance and AI in general is leveraging tools. These are things that can basically talk to your database, call different functions, call all sorts of different stuff. And then why would we want to use code, and can't Bubble do it all, right? I work for Bubble, so why am I recommending that we use code? The short answer to this is yes, Bubble can definitely do it all. And the team I'm joining, hopefully in the future, I want to get to a point, and Bubble wants to get to a point where you can just prompt this in Bubble too, and we'll set up all the workflows and AI can do everything for you. But until that point, some of the complexity here is actually it's easier to offload sometimes because AI is so good at generating very simple functions and code that we can offload it and make the maintenance of our Bubble app a lot easier, basically. Just reading some of the chat. Chris says, yes, started looking at Responses API. Yes, so the Responses API just came out. I did plan and put together the session before they launched that. So I still want to talk about this. And to be clear too, the Assistance API here is just an example. The takeaway I want everyone to have from this is that we're going to be working on this second point here, which is creating an all-in-one endpoint. So this is useful not just for the Assistance API, but anytime that you want to take multiple different functionalities. So let's say you're calling several different APIs, right? Just as an example, you might want to call, I'm just going to use a couple simple APIs that I know of, but you might want to call the REST countries API, which is a free API with country data to get some information about a country, and then use that information about a country to submit something to the weather API, which is a totally different API endpoint. And in Bubble, that requires a bunch of different setups. And so anytime you want to take multiple different API calls and combine them into a single response so that your Bubble app just has a single endpoint to reach out to and come back from, this is a very, very useful technique. We're going to be using the OpenAI assistance flow because I think it's a cool one. But yeah, Chris properly pointed out there is a new response API. There's also the agent SDK, which just came out. Very, very exciting stuff. I want to point out too, this is also a very cool use for what I'm about to show you, because right now the agents SDK is only available in Python. And Bubble does not support Python as an add-on language. So until the JavaScript SDK comes out, we can't even build a plugin for Bubble for the agents SDK. And so this would be a valid technique for that as well. Basically, the key takeaway here is, why would we want to use code? When platforms develop new APIs, they're not necessarily doing it with Bubble users in mind. They're doing it with coders in mind, and mainly JavaScript coders, right? And so sometimes those APIs are particularly difficult for us to work with as Bubble users. And I think that that's the most important time that this technique is very, very useful. So we're going to be talking about creating an all-in-one endpoint. I do want to touch on endpoint security. It's been kind of a hot topic on X or Twitter recently, both in this vibe coding world, and it's always an important topic in Bubble. So we do want to talk about securing the endpoint that we build. If we have time, we'll touch on like expanding tools, right? And like, because we're going to build an example with one simple tool, but the idea here is you can have tons of different tools, right? And then with any time at the end, we'll do a Q&A. We have a lot to get through today. I do want to point out, like, I've already built a working example of everything. So anything we don't get to, I may at the end kind of jump and do high-level overviews of some stuff, but I'm going to try to the best of my ability to build most of this out from scratch so that everyone can kind of see how we think about this stuff. Cool. So let's dive right in. I want to start by just talking about the openAI assistance flow in general, and hopefully get everyone a clearer picture of like why we would want to do this. And even though Bubble can do it all, why is it beneficial to offload this stuff to another platform? So to do that, I want to jump into a cool platform here called Excalidraw. So this is just like a flowchart thing. I think it'll be helpful to visualize some stuff. So in general, give me 1 second here. When we are talking about like calling an assistant, we basically want two things. 1 second, I'm just going to set up. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so we talk about two things, right? We have the like input that we want to send, which is usually something like a user message. And then we have the output that we want to receive, right? And that's usually like the AI response, right? Now, in a basic chatbot, this is pretty straightforward, right? There's not a whole lot to this. There we go. Because you just submit the user message, you can use like the chat completions API. Chris had mentioned the responses API. I'll probably do something similar here and just send you something back. With a format like the assistance API, this gets a lot more complicated. These squares are kind of representing like Bubble interface, right? Because like your user message is coming from an input on your Bubble app client side, and your output you want to display client side as well. So these are like our end goals. We want to get to this point where we have our input and our output. I don't know why. What did I do here with this? Oh, this is all tied. Okay. Sorry, I'm just still learning Excalidraw a little bit. So I'm going to zoom out here a little bit, and we're going to start talking about like, all right, so what's involved in the middle of these two? What do we need to do with the assistance API to go from our user message to an AI response, particularly with tools involved, right? Because there's a lot of complexity once you start adding tools. So to start, anything that I draw as a diamond is going to represent like what would be a backend workflow in Bubble, right? And so I want to really visualize this because you'll start to see how complex this gets in Bubble and how many different endpoints we have to string together just to get this functionality working. So the first one is we'd usually use like the create assistant API. And the create assistant API will actually create our assistant. In the example I'm using today, we're going to use like a pre-built assistant that I'm just going to plug in the ID. So we'll start with the second step, which will be creating a thread. Right. So when we create a thread, that's just basically attaching a thread to the assistant. And then from there, we need to create a message. Right. And at the create message step, this is really the first time that our input actually gets read, right? When we go and create the message. So we kind of have to do these two things in the background. First create the assistant or use an ID that's already created, then pass that ID to create a thread. And then finally, once we have a thread, we can go ahead and create the message, right? Now from there, the assistance API has a concept called a run. So after you create the message, you're only adding a user message to the setup. So a run is basically telling it, okay, now that I've added a user message, go and take all the context of this thread, process it with the run, and then tell me what the AI says in response. That's what a run is in OpenAI land, right? And so we create this run based off after we create the message, right? Now with the run, again, these are all separate backend endpoints, right? Because we need to enforce order. We need to make sure that things are happening in the proper order. And when I say endpoints, some of them could be custom events, right? They don't all have to be endpoints. They don't all have to be public, but it's a lot of different workflows on your backend. And then from the run, once we create that, all that did was an API call that just created it. Now a run is an asynchronous process that's going to take some time to complete. So the next step is we have to go in and we have to start, select full one, there we go. We have to start polling the run, right? So we have to poll the run. Now what that means is just check the run status, like make a call to say, hey, get me this run and check what the status is, right? And so this is going to be a separate workflow after the run is created. Now from there is where things, especially with tools, start to get more complicated. So when you poll a run, right, you're going to get a response back that's going to be one of a couple different like possible statuses. And I'll use circles for these because these won't really be like separate workflows. They'll more be like potential conditional responses that you could get that will then end up triggering other workflows, right? So from here, after the run, let's go to a new line just to like clearly separate this. You might get a status back that says, oh, the run is still in progress. So I don't have any answers for you yet. Nothing has happened and we're still processing that run, right? You might also get a response that says the run is completed, right? Great. That means we have an AI response and we can proceed here. You might also get a response that says there was an error with the run, right? So you have to handle that in Bubble too. How do we figure, okay, if there was an error with the run, how do we display that to our user or handle that? And then finally, if you're using tools, there's another potential response that is requires action. And this is basically a response from the run that says, oh, based on my AI analysis, I think that we should use one of the tools that I've been provided. So a tool is basically just a function, or in Bubble speak, like a custom event or backend workflow that you provide to your assistant, and you give it some context about that function, right? So a good example of a tool, and I'll draw this as a diamond because this would be another backend workflow, might be like a get weather tool. And that's the one that we're going to use today. Super simple, but this is just a tool that can access a real-time weather API so that your AI can always have like today's weather in any date, right? This is a common problem with AIs is that they're locked to their training period, right? So if you're just using a stock LLM out of the box, you would only be able to have like knowledgeable information from up to maybe 2023 when it stopped being trained. With something like a tool, you can use the Get Weather API to say, hey, what's the weather in Spain today, right? And you can actually get that information back. So this might be like one of our tools. Now, you can also have other tools that are, in my opinion, much more practical. And a very common thing is to have like a QueryDB tool, right? So that your AI can have contextual knowledge about all the information in your DB. You might also have like a create DB record tool, right? And these would usually be more specific. I probably wouldn't do like a general tool. It'd be like create a product record or create a user record. AI assistants, I think, can have, and don't quote me on this, check the documentation, I think up to like 128 tools or something like that. So they can get pretty extensive. You can imagine if you had 128 tools in a Bubble app, each one of those had to be a backend workflow. And each one of those, we had to do a conditional on requires action, that if the requires action tool name is this, trigger this backend workflow. If it's this, trigger this other backend workflow. So it gets super complicated. Let's connect some of these things. So from poll run, we could potentially have any of these statuses, right? Completed, error, and it could also require action. The simplest and shortest path to success is if we get a completed status right away. Then our setup on Bubble, honestly, is not that bad. Because we input the user message, we create an assistant, create a thread, create the message, create the run, pull the run, we get that it's completed, and then we get the response. If it's in progress, we have to recursively pull the run again, right? And so this is where you get a little bit of complexity because you have to create a recursive workflow that knows, okay, if it's in progress, make sure that we just call it again until it's not in progress, right? If there's an error, we also are probably going to return that error to the UI. So this is another kind of easy path, just coming right back to AI response. But then if it's required action, we have to go to the appropriate action, right? And then where things get really complex, and this is why with tools in particular, I prefer doing this off of Bubble, because after the tool gets called, it's going to return to you a tool response. And what you're supposed to do with that tool response is submit it back and create another run. And so you submit the tool response back to a run and then start this process all over again. Sometimes the AI will require 2 actions in a row. So sometimes, let's say like I had these tools available and I sent a message to my AI and I said, get me the weather for San Francisco and then query my DB for any users that are in San Francisco so that I can message them. You would probably get a requires action, get weather. We'd go back to create run. We'd pull the run again. Maybe it comes back in progress. We recursively call it. Then we get another requires action for query DB, right? And then from there, we're going to have to go back, create the run. You can start to see the complexity that really exists between just inputting a user message and coming back and getting an AI response. And this is where, like, when all these tools first started coming out, like Replit and Bolt and stuff, I started using them and realizing, like, I prefer Bubble for building simple concepts, honestly, because I like the control. I like to get it's cool that like Lovable or Bolt, they can spin up these apps and you see this like working MVP very, very quick. It's actually quite hard to iterate on them if you don't know how to code, and you end up getting into this like prompting cycle eventually. I like control over my final products. And so I started thinking of ways to use these tools that were like gave me more control, but still allowed me to leverage the AI. And so one of the things I've been doing a lot is basically abstracting away all of this complexity into an AI tool in code, and then just leaving my bubble. Like I wanted my bubble app to just be able to say in the API connector, here's my user input, return me my AI response. I don't want to have to worry about any of this stuff on Bubble. I want the code to kind of take care of all this stuff. The reality is, once you have your flow set up and you know what tools you're using and you create them, you don't have to edit them a lot. Like once they work, they kind of work. When you do want to go in and make edits, this is simple enough of a concept in code that the AI is very good at making those edits. So you actually can get away with not really knowing anything about code and not having to teach yourself too much about what the AI is doing, and still getting really, really powerful functionality in your app. So that is kind of the whole point. I haven't been on the screen in a while, so I'm just going to check to see if we have any questions going on. Don't think so. Cool. So to move on, so this is kind of like the general flow, and what we're going to try to accomplish is use Bubble just for the input and the output. And then we're going to be using Replit to basically handle everything else, right? And so the one thing that I'm not going to be doing today is teaching how to build UI in Bubble. I'm assuming that most of the audience here knows how to do that. If you have any specific questions about how I've built this UI, definitely let me know, but we're going to be concentrating mainly on the functionality. I just don't think there'd be enough time to build out the entire UI as well. So I do want to just quickly show you what our UI looks like so that we can kind of wrap our heads around what functionality we're going to be adding to this. So I have a very, very simple app here. It's just got an index page. On the index page, it's got a login sign-up group that doesn't show if the current user's logged in. So pretty simple. Once a user logs in or signs up, this group hides and the main chat group shows. The chat group also shows with a chat input on the bottom, and it's super simple like this. So very, very straightforward app. It's got an unauthenticated state and an authenticated state. The other thing I want to point out about this setup is I made the decision for the purposes of this demo that we're going to have an app that only has one thread per user. So I don't have any thread creation, thread editing, or thread selection functionality here. The idea is that I've actually built in a workflow, and you'll see that when a user signs up, oh, you know what? I actually haven't built it. I built this in my example, but I haven't built it here yet. So we can build that together. But basically, when the user signs up, we're going to want to initialize the chat and create their first thread. That's kind of the idea, right? So let's dive into like how this is going to work. Because right now, all I have is a chat group. Let's show that again with our assistant message and user message in there, and then a chat input on bottom. And you can see here that with my chat input, I don't have any workflows yet. So it's actually not functional. If we were to try to preview this app, we could log in and sign up. That part's functional, but there's no AI functionality happening yet, right? And so we're going to come back to Bubble in a little bit, but I want to jump over to Replit and start actually creating our functionality, our like assistance endpoint. And so, yeah, let's do that. So here's Replit. If you haven't used Replit before, it's really cool. Like I said, I am not a fan of like the let's like build a whole app and MVP here, but it's a really great way to use AI to get you bits of functionality that you can incorporate. I use it a lot to incorporate into Bubble. I think it's really, really great. The other reason I'm using Replit, I want to be clear, you've heard of other tools like Cursor, Windsurf, lots of different ways to like use AI to generate code. What's really nice about Replit, especially when it comes to connecting to Bubble, is they give you a dev and live endpoint for your app. And I say endpoint, but actually like a URL, because if you do have UI on Replit, it would give you a URL where you can see that UI too. But they give you URLs, and that makes it really easy for us to like just connect from the API connector without having to worry about, like if we were to build this in Cursor, we'd have to host it somewhere like Vercel. We'd have to set up all that infrastructure to like actually put it live and connect a domain. Replit kind of has all that built in out of the box. It makes it really easy to set up these types of like tools, right? Really good question in the chat about the stream function. Solve the polling run headache. Not quite. So I actually, because I work at Bubble, I've gotten to preview the stream functionality. It's very cool. It's coming out very soon. You guys are all going to really, really like it. Streaming is just a different way of returning. Like all streaming means is they don't wait for things to process. They send it back in chunks as it happens. But that includes things like tool calls. Like, so it eliminates the poll run concept, because with streaming, it's coming back to you automatically. You don't have to reach out to get the information, but it's still coming back to you, and it's still going to say required action. What should I do? And you still have to tell it, okay, since I got this, go do this. So all the conditionality behind what the poll run is doing is still there in streaming. It's just kind of like happening in a slightly different way. All right, so one of the things I want to point out about Replit, when you just type something into the box here, like create me an endpoint, this is going to use what's called the Replit agent. And the Replit agent really, really wants to build you a UI. I found that it does not, when you tell it, like, just build me an endpoint, this is a backend service only, I don't need a UI, my UI is in a totally separate app, I'm just going to be calling this endpoint. It still will just like spin up some crazy UI and complicate your code with stuff that you don't need. So I very rarely use the agent for this type of stuff. This is like, if you want to build a quick prototype or see, what something would look like, this is a good tool. But instead, we're going to just kind of create a REPL the old-fashioned way. So before they came out with Replit agent, you could always just go create an app. And there's these templates here. Now, there are lots of different things you could use. I encourage you guys, like, try Python, try different types of servers, Java. I'm pretty comfortable with JavaScript, so I've always used Node.js. Node.js is basically a server-side JavaScript framework. So you can write JavaScript on the server. It's not exposed to your client, so you can use things like secret keys safely and stuff like that. And it's pretty simple and straightforward to set up. You can set up a nice server and create an endpoint with like less than 150 lines of code usually. And that includes all the OpenAI assistant functionality and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and just click Node.js. And it gives you like a title. I'll just keep that. We'll make it private for now. And I'm going to go ahead and just create an app. And so the difference here is we're not using the agent. We have an assistant. So this is really cool. The assistant will allow us to edit the files we have for this Node.js project. And it's usually a little bit better at like listening to what we want in terms of I don't need a UI here, right? So just by default, this Node.js template gave us like a bunch of stuff that we don't really need to worry about. You don't have to worry about the package.json file or the package lock. The index.js is where our server is going to be built. And right now it's totally blank. So that's kind of where we can start working. So what I'm going to do is just enter my first prompt here. And usually, like I did a test run of this yesterday. It took me about like 3 or 4 prompts to get it right. So you do have to kind of like watch what it's doing, test it, see if like, it missed something, and then ask it and kind of keep following up. The way we're going to be testing it, I find you could use the Bubble API connector and just keep reinitializing stuff. I really like Postman as a way of just like hitting endpoints and just seeing what the response is back. And then once we get things perfect in Postman, we'll head over to the Bubble API connector and actually set up our functionality. So what I'm going to say is create me a single backend endpoint on this Node.js server that is accessible at whatever URL my app is on plus /chat. So I basically just want this to be a /chat endpoint. And we're going to tell it what it's going to do. So the endpoint will interface with the OpenAI Assistance API. It should include all of the functionality needed to create a thread, message, and run on the assistant, as well as functionality for tools and tool calling. One thing I'm going to specify here, now you can have, so there's a bunch of different ways to think about this. For the purposes of the demo, I'm not going to be creating assistants. I'm going to be using an assistant, just ID that I have, and only creating threads for the users. And so I'm going to specify that. We will not be creating assistants, only threads on a pre-existing assistant ID. The tools don't need to be set up in the code. They will be defined on the OpenAI Assistant dashboard. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. I'm going to say, however, we do need to set up the actual tool function so that we can call it when the response comes back as required action, right? The single tool we'll be using is get weather, and it will call this API. Now, I've kind of just found one in advance. It's a very, very simple one called WeatherStack. It's totally free. And so this is the documentation. So I'm just going to provide it that so that it can write a function for me that actually calls this. So I'm going to go back to Replit and we'll say here. The other thing I should do too is give it the link to the assistance API documentation. It's very helpful. So I have this kind of pre-pulled up here. I'm just going to copy this, come back and say, let's see, here is the documentation for the assistance API, like that. Cool. And then let's see. So the only other things I want to add is the endpoint should include bearer token authorization. I will be calling it from an external service and will provide an authorization bearer token header. You can create this token for me. Make sure to store all keys, or I shouldn't say make sure to. I'm going to say I will store all keys in Replit secrets. This is a functionality of Replit that allows you to just keep like your openAI key hidden and stuff like that, so you can use them accordingly. We'll say openAI API key. We're going to need a weather stack key, and we're going to need an admin, or we'll just say a bearer token, right? So that's just telling it like what to reference in the code, and I'll show you how to set that stuff up. This should be good for number one. So let's see what we get out of this. The other thing, Replit, it's kind of weird that they make you do this. When you put links like this, you can see here it like has these buttons for you to click where you can take a screenshot and get the text content. And I just like to click those. It basically stores them in your assets. I think it helps the AI like understand them a little bit better, process all the data a little bit better. So I'm just going to click those and wait for them to kind of process before I submit this. And then it should get to work for us creating this endpoint. While it works, I'm going to jump over to Postman in just a minute and start like setting that up so that we save a little bit of time. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this off. And let's just wait. Hopefully, sometimes Replit like it should kick in, but sometimes if you navigate away before it does, it freezes on you. I hope this is not going to happen. Come on. Let's see here. I'm going to give it a minute and go to Postman. And if it's still not working by the time we come back, we're going to try it again with a new chat. But hopefully that kicks in and it's just waiting. So I'm going to go to postman.com. So if you've never heard of Postman, it's just a very simple tool for calling APIs and getting responses back. It's kind of like a testing tool, basically. And so you can just set up new requests here, enter a URL. You can handle authorization, submit parameters for like the body, and then you can see a response here. So it's a very, very simple way of kind of testing things. So this is going to end up being a post. Let's go back to Replit and see if things are working yet. Yeah, I don't know why. Like Replit does this sometimes where it like freezes and doesn't let you. This is very frustrating. Let me try this again with a new chat. Try it there. Try the same stuff. If we have technical difficulties and this doesn't work, like I said, I have built this out in advance, so I can show you what Replit should do when their servers are working. Let's see. There we go. That's what I wanted to see right away. So the assistant's now processing its thinking. Let's leave it here. Again, sometimes if you navigate away from the tab, it'll mess up too. So let's wait till it's at least starting to generate some code. It's thinking is a good sign right now. So let's see. Check the chat, see if there's been any other questions that come in. Chris said, I found letting the assistant run until it updates the view, managing wait on screen. Yep. That's a good technique for doing it solely in Bubble. Okay, cool. So it's starting to work. So it's saying, I'll help you create an endpoint. It's going to need dependencies for the code. So we'll wait till it like finishes, and then I'll go up and install and apply all this stuff. Cool. So we can click it one by one or just click apply all, but I'll do one by one up here. So I'm going to install all the dependencies. That's going to run these sort of console commands for me that install things like Express, which is our server framework, Cores, which you may have heard of from Bubble, which is like cross-site origin stuff, and then openAI, the package, and then Node Fetch, which is just allowing us to make API requests from a server. And then here, so it's done that. It's created the endpoint. We're going to apply to run the application. And then it gives us some instructions. So it says to use this endpoint, set the secrets in Replit. So we have to set all of our keys, make a post request to chat, and then it should have a JSON body with a message and the assistant ID. The endpoint handles creating threads, managing tool calls, and cool. So I'm going to hit apply all. There's one thing I noticed that it didn't do that I should have prompted it for that I want to correct right now before we get any further. Cool. I'm going to say, great. Let's add an optional thread ID to the request body so that if one is submitted, we update the existing thread with a new message and then submit the run. But if one is not submitted, we create a new thread. And this will just give us that like flexibility in one endpoint to either create a thread or update an existing thread based on if we pass in an existing thread ID. So it's going to go ahead and make those changes for us. Let's see. So far, yeah, 118 lines of code. That's awesome. In my opinion, I think people may have different opinions. Like I find this reading code is not as hard as writing code once you kind of get into it. And especially with AI, you can use AI to teach you about some of the things it's doing. And honestly, with code, with a file this small, AI is incredibly good at just updating and making changes to it. You don't really have to know much about what it's doing here. You can really manage this whole thing with plain English. So it says this change allows the client to optionally pass a thread ID into the request body we use for the thread ID. Also, we need to fix the node fetch import error from the error log. So it found another error that I didn't notice, and we're going to say okay. All right. So it automatically restarted. Okay, so I think now we can add our secrets and then test it with Postman. So Replit secrets are a cool feature. They basically just allow you to store secret keys. I am going to be rotating all these keys after this session, so I'm going to expose my keys here and then just cancel them. Please don't like spam these while we're on the session. I would really, really appreciate that. I'm trusting everybody in this call. Just to point out too, if you weren't doing this on Replit, if you did want to like explore cursor or do something a little bit more like bare bones, this is usually handled in code with something called a .env file. And this is just Replit's version of that. So a .env file is a file in your code base that doesn't get published to GitHub. So it only stays on your local machine. And anyone who accesses your GitHub repository has to add their own env file with their proper secrets, so that your secrets are basically never shared with anybody. They only exist on your computer. Replit has its own version of that, which if you go to tools, it's just called secrets. And so here we can add our different secrets. And so I'm going to do this kind of one by one, but the secrets we need are openAI API key. So we'll say new secret, openAI API key. And then for the value, I'm going to go over to my dashboard and just create a new key here. So this is going to be test for dev day, or I'll just say dev day because it's not a test for it. We'll say default project, and then I'll create a new secret key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and come back to Replit and just paste that in there. So now we have our first secret. We also need the weather stack key. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to go to weather stack key. And for that, I have my dashboard pulled up. It's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to copy that and come back down here, paste that in there, add secret. Now it says generate a random string for this. So it didn't give us a bearer token. We can generate whatever we want. We can also ask it to do that for us. I'm just going to ask it because like you could go to ChatGPT or anywhere else, but this is effectively the same thing. Can you please generate a bearer token key for me to use? And this should just give me a complex key. You can use like a password manager to do this, or lots of different ways to generate a secret hash. So it's running a little console command to get a bearer token. Oh, it's telling me, yeah, so I can run this now. And then, yeah, okay, so it returned back this key. So this will be our bearer token that we use to access the endpoint. This is important. Remember, if you don't add this part, anyone can access your endpoint if they know the URL. It can be really bad. So you really want to protect this. Bearer token, I think, is what I called this. And then we're just going to store it here. This just allows our app to check against what we put in Bubble to make sure that we're authorized to access it. Cool. So we have our secrets and we have our basic code. Let's go ahead and apply all. That should run the code again. If by the way, if you try to hit this in Postman or from Bubble and it's not connecting, it's because the app has to be running on Replit until you deploy it. Run is basically running your development version, so you can test in development. And then when you want it to always be running and you want it to always be accessible, you just deploy it to live. So I'll press OK here. This has nothing to commit. Cool. So I'll just run this manually. So you see that this is normal. We don't have a UI, and it cannot get this. There's no endpoint here. It also wouldn't be able to get like /chat because it's a post request. So there's really nothing to see in this like Replit preview. It's just, we just know that our app is running. All right, let's go over to Postman now. And we're going to go ahead and test this endpoint to make sure that everything works. Now, the one thing we do need this web view for is kind of weird, but this is where we get our dev URL. So like this is what Replit considers our dev link. As long as the app is running, this is accessible. So we're going to go ahead and copy this. We're going to take it over to Postman. We're going to paste it here, and we're just going to add /chat, which is the endpoint that we set up. We're also going to need our bearer token. So I'm going to go over here to authorization. Let's go back to Replit to copy that bearer token one more time. And back here. And so we'll paste that in there. And then we just need to submit our body. So the body should have 3 things. It should have an assistant ID, a message, and then a optional thread ID, right? And so the first one we send, we're not going to include a thread ID because we don't have one yet. So it should have an assistant ID like that. And this is just regular JSON like you would put in the raw body of an API connector. And we'll get that in a second. And then comma, and then the message is going to be like, we'll just send a test of like, hello, how are you? And so let's get our assistant ID. So this is actually a good point to talk about the tools on OpenAI's end. So if you go to your OpenAI dashboard, in dashboard here, I'm just going to go to assistants. I have one set up from yesterday. Yeah, we'll just use this one. This is very simple. Your helpful assistant does whatever the user asks you to. You also have access to a weather tool to fetch by location. And so this just informs it that it has access to this tool. And you actually define the tools down here. You can add a function. Now, when you add functions here, I want you to keep in mind, you're not defining any functionality here. This is a JSON description of what the function does. The function is defined in our code. So if we actually look in our code here at what it generated, we can see this async function get weather. This is the actual functionality that's calling the API. It's using our access key, and it's submitting a query for the location. And then it's waiting for the response, and it's returning that response to us. So all the functionality for the tool exists in the code. But on the assistant end, you need to tell the assistant, hey, you have access to this. These are the parameters it needs, and this is what you should expect it to do. So if I click into this, this is a standardized format by OpenAI, and by actually, it works amongst Claude tools and things like that too. But it's just a JSON description. So you see, we name the function, we call it get weather. This is what's going to be returned with requires action. So it's going to say requires action, which action? Well, the name is get weather. A description just helps the AI know when should I call this tool, right? Strict is if you want to stick it to a JSON schema. So if you want to only return JSON from this tool, you can do that with strict is true. Here, I just want to return a text string. And then the parameters. And this is what does the AI need to submit to this function in order to get a proper response, right? If we don't submit a location to this function, and again, that's defined right here in the code, right? Get weather, we need to send a location. If it has no location, it can't get the weather for anything, right? So we need to tell the assistant that, well, it requires parameters. The type is object. It has some properties, and the first one is a location, which is of type string, and the AI needs a description, like what is that parameter? Well, it's the city name or location to get the weather for. The more specific you can be here, the more effective your AI is with these tools. The descriptions are really important, naming things, typing them out, and then you're also saying if any of those parameters are required. So this is how you would have optional parameters, basically. If your function maybe optionally took in some other data about the location, you could just not include it in the required, but include it up here, and that would tell your AI that it's not necessary. So that's our assistant. We're going to go ahead and just copy this ID and go back to Postman, and we're going to say we want to use that assistant, right? And so let's see. I don't know if it's going to work on the first try. It may get an error, but we'll debug live if we do. We'll go ahead and send. The app is not currently running. Nice. So something must have happened. Why is the app not currently running? It should be currently running. I have it open. Let's make sure our URL is correct. That is odd. Deploy this app to Q2. Do I have to deploy it? No, because I should be able to use the dev URL as long as it's running. Did I have the dev URL in there wrong? Oh, I have 2 slashes there. Is that intentional? I couldn't reach this app. Let me try restarting it. Oh, yeah, see, I'm getting, yeah, something's happening here. All right, Replit server got messed up. Let me stop and then run again. That's a Replit issue. It does get frustrating sometimes with that stuff when you have multiple tools. Let's refresh Replit. Let's stop it. Give it a second. Then let's run it again. Let's get it up and running. If we have to, I can deploy this, but I'd rather just. Good sign. Cool. So we got a response from the AI. That's awesome. And now just to test like that we've abstracted away all the complexity. Let's say like, and we also want to test our optional thread ID, right? So here I'm going to add in, same assistant, but I'm going to add in a thread ID. And you notice that the thread ID actually gets, oh, it's not. It should be, we need to return the thread ID here. So I need to tell Replit that. So we'll say, can you please always return the thread ID in addition to the response? This is important so that we can continue iterating and adding messages to existing threads. That needs to be returned back with it. So in other words, our response here should be a response and then a comma and then the thread ID for what thread that is. That way, when we create a new one, we get it back. So let's go ahead and see if Replit's able to do that. Looks like Replit's going to freeze on us. That's always nice. Let's start a new chat. It's having some fun issues right now. One more time, refresh. Oh, there it goes. Just started going as I got impatient. Okay, it's going to reload for us. Let's see if it works. After we get through this part, what I'm probably going to do is open up my, I don't think we're going to have time to build out the whole Bubble functionality from scratch, but I do want to go through what those workflows look like once you get them set up in Bubble and how much simpler everything looks now that you have this like all-in-one endpoint to handle all of your tool calling for you. So it says, great, I'll help you modify the code. Now when you make a request, the response will include both the assistant response and the thread ID. That's exactly what I want. So apply those code changes, and now it's going to rerun the endpoint. And now let's send that same thing again. So we'll create a new thread again that just says, hello, how are you? And we should see the thread ID come back in addition. Boom, there it is. So we're going to go ahead and grab that. And we're going to add the thread ID here. That. I'm going to add a comma here so that it's valid JSON. And then instead of hello, how are you, let's test our tool. So say like, what is the weather in, I don't know, Spain, or I guess we should be more specific, like Barcelona, Spain right now. And let's go ahead and send. And it's going to think for a bit. And we shouldn't even see any of this complexity. Oh, expected tool outputs. Oh no. Something happened with the tool outputs. Okay, we need to give our AI this. This should not generally happen, but usually when I make a request that requires the tool, I'm getting this error. Sometimes this will work out of the box. Like when I tested this last night, I didn't get this error and everything just set up correctly, but AI is usually pretty good at fixing this stuff quickly. Let's see. The issue is that when the assistant requires a tool, you need to properly handle and submit all tool outputs. Let's modify the check completion. Cool, handle the tool call, let's apply. I'm blindly trusting a lot of stuff right now, but let's see. Let's try that again. Can't add messages. Oh, because it runs active. Okay. I'm going to create a new thread with this. So what happened there, basically what happened there is because we got an error, the run is still considered active. And so we couldn't add additional things to that. I'm not going to go, you can handle those errors and cancel the run and stuff, but I want to get through the main functionality here. So we'll just create a new thread to ensure that our tool calls are working. It's usually a good sign when it takes a little bit of time because it means it's calling the tool and submitting the outputs. Let's see. Am I having internet issues? What is going on? Interesting. So something with my weather call is not working. Let me pull open. We could iterate in the interest of time. Normally, what I do is just keep iterating on this. So keep sending it this. It would fix it eventually. I do want to make sure that we get the payoff of this session. So I want to show you what what this looks like when it's done correctly after we would iterate through all this. And so there is another. Let's see. I think if I go here, just check something. Yeah. Okay. So if I go over here. So here is the one that I built yesterday. Just to show you, like this one-shotted it in, or I should say one shot, but it got it in like 1, 2, 3, 4 prompts, and it was 5 prompts, and it was fully working. So again, this other one that we were getting that error for, I would normally keep going through, but I don't want to spend the rest of the time debugging live. I'd rather show you what this works like once you get through that debugging process. So here, this is a working version of that endpoint. What I'm going to do is basically the same thing, just run this. And then I'll get the dev URL there, like so. And then we'll go back to our Postman and just replace that here. It's the exact same format. It takes all the same parameters, uses all the same APIs. So let's see if this one works. Oh, invalid token, because that's not my bearer token there. Let's go back to here. Here's my bearer token. Copy that. Back to Postman. Change that out. Go. Current weather in Barcelona is a thunderstorm. So again, like once you iterate through, you will end up getting this tool call response stuff working. And now you have a really nice, like abstracted away, all the complexity of openAI is now just working in the code. And we can use Bubble to just simply call this and get the stuff back that we need to. So over on the Bubble end of things, let's take a look at what that would look like. So here is a version of this app that is a little bit more set up. And I was going to build this through live with everyone, but we are running a little bit short on time. So instead, I'm going to kind of do a high-level overview because I know all of us know how functionality works in Bubble and things like that. I don't think you need to see this built up from scratch. So what I'm going to do here is just hide the login sign-up group. We have our chat group here, and we have our floating chat input down here. And so what this is doing is I've set up a call in the API connector. And that call takes a private key and header. Here's our bearer key from that other one that we were just looking at. It calls the assistant just like we did in Postman. This is the live endpoint, so we no longer have to have Replit running all the time. I actually deployed this, and so this is just calling that endpoint and then /chat. And then it just takes parameters. I kept the assistant ID as a private one because we're not going to change it out, but you could, in theory, make this public and have users create new assistants at the same time, add anything you want to your endpoint. We can submit a message and a thread ID, and then that is going to return us the thread ID and the response, right? And so very, very simple, but it has access to all these tools. The other thing I've installed here is just a Markdown to BB code converter. If you know, LLMs usually respond with Markdown syntax, and this is a really great plugin to just convert that into BB code so it displays nicely in your chat. And then what would have been tons of backend workflows is now just all front-end logic here because everything else is secured behind the endpoint. So if we go to our chat input and then right here, we can see the logic that's happening. So basically we have a chat. It's going to submit the thread ID. Now this is coming from signup. This is what I was going to show you before. This is trigger initialized chat, which over here just creates a new thread behind the scenes, right? Hey, what can you do with no thread ID? So it's going to create a new one. And then I'm saving, my UI is all powered by the Bubble database. So over here, you can see I have a conversation that stores the OpenAI thread ID, and I have a message that stores the content of the message, the conversation, and then role is just assistant versus user. And so every time we make a call, we're going to create DB records, and that's what's going to power our UI. It'll let us proactively update our UI so we can show like little thinking things while the AI is typing and everything like that. And then, so we initialize the chat with that. We create a new conversation with the thread ID and store it there. Then we parse whatever the response's markdown is into BB code if it exists. And then we create the new assistant message with that BB code as the content attached to the conversation. You notice here for the initialization, I did not create a user message just because when a user signs up, I want the assistant message to be the first thing that they see. So even though we sent a user message, I didn't reflect that in my DB because I don't want that user message to show up. This is more of like a behind the scenes message. From there, every user has one chat. So now that's initialized. I just have a very simple variable on the page that looks for the first conversation created by the user, because this is an app that only has one conversation per user, and stores it as the current convo. So we always know what the current user's convo is. And that way, when we send a message, we can access that OpenAI thread ID from the current convo. And then we can use the inputs value formatted as JSON safe to send it to our chat. Again, all the tool calls will happen there. We'll eventually just get a response. We're first going to create the user message because we do want this one reflected in our UI. So we just mimic what we sent to OpenAI with a user message. Then we parse the responses markdown, and we create the assistant message with the results, as well as attaching it to the current conversation. And that's really it. Now we have fully functional AI functionality on Bubble with all the tool calls happening offsite. And I found this workflow to be really, really nice. It's really, I mentioned at the beginning, we cover like adding tools. It becomes pretty easy to come in here and say like, okay, if we kind of break down what the code looks like in here, it's not that many parts, right? This one's 146 lines, but if you collapse the different parts of it, right? This is like our tool calls here. This is checking the bearer tokens. This is like our authentication here. So that never really needs to change. That's going to, in fact, let's like move that up here so that it just kind of stays out of our way. This is just initializing OpenAI. And so, yeah, the tool calls can all go here, and then all the AI functionality is here. Now, in terms of adding tools, we don't have to worry about parsing all this. But what I want to point out is that in the code, what it's basically doing is saying, if the run status is required action, get the tool calls from that required action, and set the tool outputs array. So basically what this is going to do is call all the tools at once, which is really, really nice, and just wait for all those responses. And so we don't have to like do a lot to iterate here, other than every time we add a tool, we need to add the specific logic for that tool. And we can have AI do this for us, right? So like, let's say we wanted to add a DB tool. We would prompt something like, add a new tool that calls my app's data API. Here is the documentation. And then I'd like insert Bubble data API documentation, right? And then I'd say something like create the function as well as the conditional tool call within the, and let's just be specific so the AI doesn't get confused, I'll call it the run status while loop, right? And if I were to send that, it would likely one-shot that and get it right on the first try. Just looking at the documentation, and then you just have that tool in your app. Obviously, we saw today, sometimes it's not always the case. Sometimes in any time you're using AI to generate code, you're going to get into these cycles where it doesn't get it right. You have to keep sending it back the error. You have to keep hoping that it fixes that error for you. And sometimes it can get frustrating, and sometimes it can take quite a while. But I promise you with stuff like this, you're limiting the chance of that as much as possible. And when it does happen, I would be willing to say, like with this one over here that we started running into that error, I think if I had spent another 10 to 15 minutes max on it, it would have been working just fine. I just didn't want to spend that time because I wanted to get to the other important stuff. So yeah, I'm going to wrap up there. It went a little longer than I want, so we don't have as much time for QA as possible. I happen to have some extra time to stay after one. I can hang if people have questions. I know John is here too. So if anyone has questions, I'll go ahead and let John speak up if he has any input on that stuff. But yeah, let me know if anybody has any questions. You can either type them in the chat type them in the chat and then we can answer them. Otherwise we'll wrap up in just a couple minutes here. But I hope you guys enjoyed the session, and yeah, I had a lot of fun chatting about this stuff with everyone. What IDE are you using? That was from a little while ago, from about a half hour ago. This is Replit. So Replit is the IDE. Personally, I use Cursor if I'm like doing like actual like coding stuff on my local computer and gonna host it myself. Lots of good IDEs out there. Cursor, just for those of you who are interested, is a fork of VS Code. I used VS Code for a long time when I was learning to code, and Cursor, like you feel very at home in Cursor. It's basically just VS Code, like super powered with AI. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Luke says, which Replit plan is necessary to replicate what you demonstrated? Good question. So I have this. I think you could probably get pretty far with the free one, honestly, because this isn't a lot of prompting. I think the base, I only have the base level Replit plan. I think it's like $20 a month. And that gets me very, very far. Replit's usage based, so you can set overages and limits. So even though it's $20 a month, like I can go over that, and I have a limit. Like you can see here, your usage for this chat was 10 cents. The free plan gives you a certain amount of like dollar credits to use the chat. So like you don't have to pay 10 cents every time you chat. And then the $20 a month plan just gets you more than that. How to apply security to the API calls? Should they be in Bubble or the AI code? Yeah, good question. So the security is in both, right? There's a bearer token here, so we're verifying the token in the code. But then on the Bubble end, we're also sending that along with the API call, right? So in the Bubble end, whoops, wrong screen. When we make the API call in the API connector, we have to send along a bearer token here. And that's how the authentication is. This part is very, very important. If you don't secure the endpoint, it is open and will be hacked. And openAI bills can get very, very expensive. So please secure your endpoint. The reason this is secure, I just want to kind of go over this like twofold. So this part of the Bubble API connector is totally secure. I'm exposing it here because I'm going to roll this key right after this, and this won't be accessible. But this won't be exposing your client ever. This is a perfectly safe place to put a bearer key on your Bubble side. Obviously, any app editors can access this. So you want to trust who you allow access to your editor. But and then on the code side, the reason this is secure is twofold. Number one, our index.js file and our entire code here is a server. It's not, none of this code is being sent to the client ever, except for the response, the specific response that we requested, which is a thread ID and an assistant ID. Nothing else will be sent to your browser. And so that's one thing that makes it secure. The other thing that makes it secure is like, you have to be careful. I may end up hosting this code on GitHub to share with someone or say like, hey, look what I built. And so because of that, you want to make sure too that not only, like if I do that, if I were to hard code and say like, you know, token equals this complicated token, and then publish this to GitHub, that token's now exposed on GitHub. So you do have to be careful. That's why we use the Replit secrets feature. And what that does is just allow us to protect those keys back here. So my API token is here. And then in the code, what it does is it references that. So you can see, let me see if I can find where that is. Authenticate token. There should be a spot somewhere where it authenticates the token. Yeah, here we go. Process.m.api token. So it's referencing that backend secret that I put into Replit. That way, if I push this to GitHub, all a user is seeing on GitHub is this process.m.api token. It doesn't give them any information. Show the workflow of the parse the markdown to BB code again. Yes, definitely. So that workflow, here's the plugin. It's very, very simple. Parse markdown to BB code. It gives you one action. And so the workflow for that is when we send, we first call the assistant. We then create the user message. So we don't need to parse markdown for a user message because in general, like your user's not going to be submitting markdown. Maybe you have an app where you encourage them to do that. So you want to do that here, but most of the time your user's not going to be expecting to type like asterisk and see bold text. So I wouldn't worry about the user side of things, but what we do want to do is when the assistant comes back, we have this action in here. It just says, what's the markdown? Well, the markdown is the response from the chat, right? So whatever the response is, if there's markdown in there, convert it to BB code. That's all that's saying. If there's not markdown in there, it'll just pass through the text. So you're not going to like lose information. It's just going to say if anything looks like markdown, make it BB code instead. And then here, when we create the new message, we store the content as the result of step 4. So the markdown to BB code actions BB code. And that's what allows it to display dynamically. Thank you all for the kind words. Appreciate that. I appreciate everyone joining today. It was a lot of fun. Any last questions? Like I said, I do have some extra time, so if anyone wants to hang around and ask a couple more questions, I'm perfectly happy to. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Give it a couple extra seconds of awkward silence. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. You all are awesome. Hope you have a great rest of your dev day. Yeah, and enjoy the rest of the sessions. Talk to you all soon.